Hello, welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm just going to take a few moments to introduce the video that comes after this introduction. As you all might be aware, this semester I'm teaching online classes, and we often have at least one or two live sessions every week. But of course, for privacy reasons, I cannot make those sessions available publicly. So what I've decided to do is to edit some of those online lectures as they are recorded and extract from them some useful materials that I can share publicly with a wider audience. So with that hope, I will be making some of these class sessions available to you over the semester. I hope this is useful to you. I hope you can use these in your classes, and I hope you can also use them personally for your own education. This class and these excerpts that I will be making available are from my graduate literary theory survey. So as always, please let me know if you have any questions in the comment section, if you would like me to add something else or enhance the level of engagement with you through these recorded versions. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much, and let's watch one of the lectures, the redacted version, and see how it goes. Thank you, and here it is. Page 16, right? He talks about it was in fact only with what we now call the Romantic period that our own definitions of literature began to develop. The modern sense of the world literature only really gets underway in the 19th century. Literature in this sense of the word is an historically recent phenomenon. It was invented sometime around the turn of the 18th century and would have been thought extremely strange by Chaucer or even Pope. What happened first was a narrowing of the category of literature to so-called creative or imaginative work. Good. So that's the Romantic period, right? Which we associate with Shelley, with Keats, of course, with Lord Byron and my favorite poet, and also, with Wordsworth. And think of it, Wordsworth and Coleridge both publish their works, and one publishes a preface, the other publishes another important introduction to poetry, right? And then emphasis in Romantic literature is on imagination, creating this alternative space. So think of some different poems, right? La Belle Dame sans Merci, right? The woman, right? In most Romantic poems, the action is you start from the present, from the material world, and then you enter this realm completely of imagination, right? Kubla Khan is a great example of it, right? Even an ode to Grecian urn is a great example of it. I mean, what is the material cause for the poem, right? The Sylvan marbles have just reached England, right? England has been able to plunder them and bring them to the British Museum. And so Keats starts from the relief art on an urn, right? That's where we start. And where do we go? Truth is beauty, beauty, truth. That is all all you need to know, right? So we move from the material world, but we go into this realm. And sometimes there is a falling action. We come back to this world, or most of the times we get lost into that imaginative world, right? So literature being imaginative or an act of imagination, and in that the role of the poet is then that of the bard, that the carrier of wisdom, right? And all that. So Romantic poetry isn't about romance, right? It's about this idea that we as human beings are capable of creating beauty through imagination, making sense of things through an act of imagination. So there's a lot of human will involved in that. And the role of creative imagination. Now, Eagleton also grounds us in the material realities of when the Romantic literature was being produced, right? I mean, this is when the heart of London is being gouged out and the industry is rising. The River Thames, it's like totally polluted. People are in the streets, industrialism is rising. That pastoral ideal of a life, country life is being destroyed. England is being urbanized. So these are the environments in which these poets are writing. So that's why there is emphasis on nature in Coleridge and Wordsworth, right? Emphasis on some form of spirituality, Byron, some form of heroism, right? All of these are in one way or the other are constructed as a response to the destruction of what they had known as this beautiful London and England. So I could see how it could perpetuate a national soul through imagining and adding to the national mythology. And so that's really crucial, is that this is also the time when England is trying to develop, its own particular national identity. And the rise of English literature becomes, or establishment of English departments becomes a project of nation building, because if you think of traditional definitions of nations, one aspect of it is that they have similar beliefs, but they also have certain national mythologies and belief systems. Now, you couldn't base your religion only on church, right? Previously, yes, there was the distinction between the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church in England, Church of England. But now we are in post-Americas, right? The American early mythology of the nation is Protestant, right? So how do you create an English identity, cultural, beyond religion, is that you must go and recover English history. You must go and recover English mythologies and create a national literature, right? Which is in English, which is not in French, which was part of the lingua franca of Europe, and which is distinctly English. So hence a retrieval of Chaucer and all these other poets, and then reappraisal of Shakespeare into this great monumental figure, a figure so tall that we are still talking about it. So it is part of the national project, their own past, right? So in so many ways, these stories, playwrights, histories, and literary arts then become instrumental in defining a certain kind of Englishness. Now, also keep in mind that English isn't just being used as a subject to create English subjectivities. It is also eventually the instrument of empire. And now, if we are talking about 19th century, by this time, England already has India, right, as part of the empire, right? And most of the African holdings have already been captured. So this is an empire which has huge imperial machinery, right? And so then to train your civil servants whom you will send abroad, right? Now in the British system, and that's not in the book, the civil servants needed to take a centralized exam, right, to become part of the civil service. So one of the exams that they now have to take is on English literature, right? Because that enables them to become more English subjects. But then that's exported to the colonies. English curriculum is introduced in pretty much all universities and school systems in all the English colonies. And that is where Shakespeare and all these other poets are taught to teach the value of Englishness through the works of art, right? So it becomes not just a national project, but also an imperial project. I think also new criticisms, fetishization of poetry can be helpful in thinking about literature replacing religion when the poem becomes an object of worship and reference or mystical authority. Yeah, yes, not just the poem, but no, it's never really a clean break. Literature doesn't come here like charging out of a pen and says, religion, get outside, I'm going to take over. There are material causes for failure of religion, right? One, of course, is the scientific knowledge is emerging, right? Two, I mean, there is a huge proletariat walking in the cities, living in the cities. These are people who used to have deeply pastoral lives. They lived in small towns, lands owned by their masters. They worked as peasant farmers. They worked as serfs. Now the landholders have closed the commons and they are moving to the city right when industry is rising. So these people, right, they have no place to live. There are no labor laws, they drink hard, they work hard, and most of the times they neither have the time to go to church on Sunday or need to go to church on Sunday. And so the number of people who are no longer living in places that were highly socially regulated has drastically increased in the cities. And then these are also the people who tend to be poor, right? And so their interest in religion on lower end of the society is already waning. And on the intellectual end, science has kind of laid claims to so many claims of religion itself. So religion is under attack from both sides and in a way loses its appeal to masses in general or on a massive scale. And that's where Arnold comes in, right? If religion cannot civilize the people or give them moral values, what will, right? So Matthew Arnold's argument was that, the argument, very racist and class-based, but the idea was that we always look up to our betters and we emulate them to formulate our own identities. And Arnold believed that the middle class was too Philistine. They had no manners, they were greedy. I mean, remember, this is also the time of rampant capitalism, right? And so his idea was that a literary education or literature would civilize the middle class, give them that education and those sensitivities which the nobility always had because of their breeding, right? And if then the middle class becomes educated and civilized and cultured, then the working classes will have this immediate class above them to which they aspire, but also which will be their role model. And that was Arnold's argument. Right? Good questions. Essentially, how can you both establish a tradition and only analyze individual works on their own? So I think, Vince, your response. The motivation for formalizing the study of an English seems kind of at odds with practical criticism and close reading. Yes and no. Okay, so if you are an English person, first of all, how would you argue for establishing an English department, right? That it is in the interest of the English masses who go to the university to study their own culture. How do we argue to our deans over here and the people sitting in the regent's office for English departments? I mean, do we tell them that they will become better at reading poetry? No. What we now argue is that if they have English classes, if they learn the classics, they will be able to become good and critical readers. And these are the skills that are needed in the workplace, right? Our argument is still utilitarian. So if you are trying to establish the English department, you will first try to convince the powers that be, the universities and others, that it's a worthy pursuit. And it's a worthy pursuit because there are great works of literature in English. But when Englishmen will read their own literature, it will kind of make them more English. One. Then you also want to tell them that this is not a dilettante affair. And then you go into, we practice a scientific mode of reading the text. Here are the modalities that we use. Here are the vocabularies that we use. These are the techniques that we will teach them, the skills to read texts carefully. So the larger aim is to expose people to the English masterpieces, but then also give them the skills of reading them carefully so that you can also argue that you're a discipline. So that whole idea of reading individual texts carefully and writing about them in a specialized manner fits very perfectly in trying to convince the powers that be that not only what you do is crucial to national identity, but it also has its modes of doing things. Not everyone can do that, and only people who are educated in it can do that. So an argument for the discipline itself, and then the disciplinary argument is based in that we have a method. We have a scientific method of studying this. Remember, Eagleton tells you that they were first established in technical schools. The idea was to give basic reading skills to tech school students and also teach them virtue and teach them the value of being English. When it comes to Oxbridge, right, when it comes to Cambridge and Oxford, there are already professors who have transitioned from their previous emphasis on classics to English literary studies. They have an agenda and they are devising modes of reading, and they have a journal, right? Scrutiny. And in Scrutiny, they don't only publish essays, right? They also publish how to do criticism because they are formalizing it. And the reason they are formalizing it because they have to have a method. If you're going to convince anyone that you're a viable field of study, viable discipline, the first question you ask them is, how do you conduct your research? Now, also keep in mind that at this time, book reviews and everything else usually were written by upper class ladies, right? It was considered a woman's job. Not that there is something wrong with it, but these critics are also trying to establish that what they do is specialized and can only be taught at a university, right? Something that we do even now. Now, it might sound elitist, but it also does one thing. It opens up access to culture to middle classes, okay? Because you don't have to be born in a noble family to be able to appreciate art or a good poem or a good piece of music. You can go to college and learn that and become a critic or become an art appreciator or become a musician. So that's the door that it opens when it becomes part of the university curricula and becomes a department. It opens that space for the middle classes to claim expertise and to have respectable jobs after that. English being a poor man's classics and the initial view of English having feminine aspects. So the feminine aspects were the same as I told you. The idea was that only, housewives wrote book reviews, right? And wrote about novels. Now the novel, the queen genre of English, late 19th century, 20th century, Ian Watt has a beautiful book on it, The Rise of the Novel. But remember, the novel becomes a sensational genre because of women readers. There is a huge rise in education and in reading habits. And so the novel becomes immediately a hit because it appeals to the reading public. But also, most of the readers are women. And women were the ones who were also writing reviews. Early English classes were also predominantly women, okay? And Eagleton makes a fun of it because here were these male professors talking about muscular writing and all while talking to sometimes an all-female class. And then it was considered poor man's classics because classics were established departments. But, not anyone could get into a classics program. I mean, you had to know your Latin, you had to know some other classic languages to study. and only those who could afford it could do that. Whereas you could very easily take an English course at a trade school, and then when English is introduced at Cambridge and Oxford, you could take them at Cambridge and Oxford as well. So it opens up that space for the middle classes. So then is his discussion of the symbol for the Romanticists, right? It's on page 19, right? And at the center of aesthetic theory at the turn of the 18th century is the semi-mystical doctrine of the symbol. For Romanticism, indeed, the symbol becomes the panacea for all problems. Within it, a whole set of conflicts which were felt to be insoluble in ordinary life between subject and object, the universal and the particular, the sensuous and the conceptual, material and spiritual, could be magically resolved. It is not surprising that such conflicts were sorely felt in these periods. Objects in a society which could see them as no more than commodities appeared lifeless and inert, divorced from the human subjects who produced or used them. Cool. Now we are headed towards alienation, right? Because if you have created a society of alienated beings, and there is no practical mode of disalienation, literature itself becomes a path to disalienation. So first of all, alienation. When I use that abomination, I mean, we all live in a capitalistic society, of course. When I use the word alienation, what do you understand by it? So how does a person become alienated? So Marx imagines human beings to be productive, that we are, by our nature, we are productive beings. We want to make things, right? We want to work, right? But in the capitalistic society, we have to go and make things that have got nothing to do with our vocation. We make commodities which are sold. We get a salary because we rent our body. And that's the alienated labor. Labor alienated from not just their essence, but what they are meant to do, right? And so the idea of disalienation in Marx then is to reconcile a worker, reconcile workers to what they love to do, okay, what they want to do, what is part of their humanistic essence, right? So what you mentioned as alienation, who was it? Is actually, in Hegel, it's estrangement, right? These are two very close concepts. Estrangement is estrangement from the commodities that you produce, from the world in which you live. Alienation is alienation from yourself because you're producing things that you have nothing invested in. So the revolution in Marx was to reconcile the workers with their humanity, with their vocations, right? And literature offers non-alienated labor. No, it doesn't offer non-alienated labor, but it offers, the romantic literature offers an escape from it, right? So if the world in which you live is of material reality, alienation, right, where constant commodities are being produced, where nature is being destroyed, right? So a poem then becomes this place that you escape to, right? Imaginative creation, yes, Derek. So imagination becomes the place where you can reconcile yourself with yourself, right? Where you can, and this is not just in the British case. There is a really amazing book by a University of Minnesota historian called David Noble. So David Noble was a historian, is still a historian, I think. And in one of his books, Death of a Nation, he gives us a history of American historiography, not American history, but history of American historiography. But he uses a lot of literature in his history. And what he says is, while talking about rise of modernism in United States, but also rise of new criticism, he talks about the Vanderbilt people, right? Like the whole group, the fugitives, I think. And what John Crow Ransom and people like Cleanth Brooks and all, what they believed that, okay, so in American historiography, the historians have imagined America in different terms, right? So if you come from Charles Baird and Mrs. Baird, they had a certain view of America. If you come to Hofstadter, his idea of America was a pastoral landscape. America was supposed to be Protestant, and it was supposed to be small husbandmen, farmers, having 5-acre farms, and it was never supposed to be capitalistic, right? So by the time we get to these people in the 1920s and 30s in Vanderbilt, the Southern Agrarian Party had also been vanquished, and it was no longer a political force. So they realized that the pastoral America that they had imagined to be the ideal America was no more. And they literally declare in their writing that we cannot find that America in the real world. Capital has arrived, right? America has become capitalistic, and capitalism was considered a European corrupt system, okay? So the only place they said we could find and protect this America, this city upon the hill, was in the pages of works of art and in the Ivory Tower. So that withdrawal to the Ivory Tower and to the pages of the book was not necessarily withdrawal from the world itself, but it was actually a heroic act, because they were trying to preserve. In an imperfect world, the only perfect thing could be a work of art, which had an organic whole, right? And which you, me, and everyone else could study and appreciate, because hidden in it was the America that was being lost. And that's kind of what the Romantics are doing, or also the later poets in the British scenes. Keep in mind that Eagleton is a materialist scholar, right? He's a Marxist. So every time he gives us a shift, right, he will give us a genealogy of shift in ideas, but he will also give us the material causes, right? So if you're a materialist, if you're a Marxist, the basic difference between idealists and materialists is the idealists believe that the world changes because new ideas have emerged, right? So the materialist will say the world changed, hence the consciousness changed, hence new ideas emerged. So that's the reversal in idealism versus materialism. And being a Marxist, Eagleton always grounds his argument in material changes and shifts. Okay, axe to grind. Yes, I mean, the problem with that kind of escape into imagination was that it didn't promise a social change. It only gave an imaginative way of escaping the reality, but then made that imagination into a fetish, right? That since we cannot sustain life outside, or we can sustain it, but life has become terrible, an imaginative career in writing, in art, can replace that, right? Life can still be loved and lived through an act of imagination. So it becomes a kind of escape. Everything in it, but imagination and work of art being offered, right, as an escape from the realities of life, from the necessities of life. And you can see that in the works of poets. I mean, Keats dies at 26, right? Shelley, especially in the works of Wordsworth, and Coleridge, right? We will start our discussion on Thursday from page 21, where he goes to Arnold. Now, remember, it's posted as a progressive narrative, but there are other things happening too while these things are happening in England. So we can't escape the linearity of this thing. But for example, slightly post-Romantic period, as soon as we enter into the Victorian age, one thing that a lot of my friends here, Victorianist friends, forget, or even my Romanticist friends forget, is how quickly the arguments made by especially Coleridge and Wordsworth reach the colonies. Okay, so if you look at lyrical ballads and the preface to the lyrical ballads, I'm not exactly sure when does it come out, right? But by 1870, 57, no, not 18, by 1860, in India, in Urdu literature, there is already a movement that is called the Nature movement, right? These are nature philosophers who have drawn their ideas from the Romantics, right? But how deeply are they engaged in it, that there is a school of poetry that emerges in Urdu poetry called nature poetry, right? It has its own poets. They argue their points. They have their opponents who actually nature becomes a bad word in Urdu poetry. If you wanted to call someone a name, you would call them, he's a nature, right? It has so much of an influence that Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the founder of one of the universities in 1858 in in India, North India, writes a 7-volume exegesis of the Quran from a natural point of view, right? And he's derided for it, but he says, I'm going to read the Quran and explain it from a scientific point of view, which was called natural point of view. So taking the concept from Wordsworth, the poetry of nature, goes to India, is first considered poetry of nature, and then one of the greatest poets of that time in Urdu, Altaf Hussain Hali, writes his own book called Muqaddama-e-Sher o Shairi, right? The introduction to poetry, right? New poetry, in which he insists the same things that these people are insisting on, right? That poetry should use natural vocabularies, that the words, we should be able to feel them, we should be able to chew them, right? There should be less and less reference to esoteric things and all. So that's not Romantic, that's Victorian poetry, right? That's the influence that's reaching from England to one of the colonies, right? And I'll someday write something about it, but there hasn't been much published about it. Okay. All right, so I don't see any questions here. So that's all I have. I'll pause a little more and see if you have any questions. If not, we'll start from page 21, talk about Arnold. And meanwhile, you can also read the Arnold essay, Functions of Criticism, which is in your anthology. Right? So this concludes this edited version of a live lecture. I'll be back with more. And please keep an eye out for these, and I hope these are useful to you. Thank you so much, and as always, peace and love.